Hey everyone, it's Mostly Casual Commander. I'm BK. We're on Discord, Instagram, and Patreon. Links in the description. We're back with more Lord of the Rings commanders. Kyle is playing partner commanders Frodo and Sam. He's looking to drain his opponents out with a bunch of sacrificial tokens. Matt is playing Aragorn the Uniter. He's going to outvalue his opponents by casting a bunch of legendary multicolored spells. Sauron the Dark Lord is being piloted by Chris. He's looking to amass a giant army and crush his opponents with it. And lastly, we have Scott playing Lord of the Nazgul. It's a Wraith tribal deck that's chock full of cantrips so that he can get more Wraiths. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and stick around for an appearance from my fat cat Meatball. He's so chunky. Kyle kicked things off by dropping a Temple Garden, having it enter the battlefield untapped so that he can cast Delighted Halfling. That's a pretty good Monodork. He passed the turn over to Matt, who played Fabled Passage as his land for turn, and then passed to Chris, who dropped a Swamp Drop, over to Scott with an Island, into a Soul Ring. And with that out, he also casts a fancy Lightning Greaves, Secret Lair drop. He passed the turn back over to Kyle, who drops Woodland Cemetery in order to cast his commander, Frodo Adventurous Hobbit. Kyle then moves into combat, heading at Scott, and Matt decides this was a good time to crack his Fabled Passage in order to find a mountain. Scott takes his beats, and Kyle passes the turn over to Matt. He then plays a Command Tower as his land for turn, before casting Sylvan Library, aiming to draw some additional cards this game, I see. He passes the turn over to Chris. He drops another Swamp as his land, and then he casts Orcish Bowmasters. This thing's great. It's going to amass him 1, getting an Orc army, and it could ping stuff down later on. That's cool. He then passes the turn over to Scott, who draws, and he plays a fancy Gitaxian Probe. So he'll pay 2 life in order to cast that with its Phyrexian mana. He peeks the scene at Matt's hand, and then draws a card which triggers Orcish Bowmasters, amassing 1 for Chris, and he'll throw a point of damage at Scott. He then plays Cabal Pit before casting Sedgemoor Witch. So if Scott's able to start casting some cantrips, he'll make some 1/1 black and green pest creatures. Not that bad. He's hoping to protect his investment by equipping Lightning Greaves to it, and then he moves into combat, swinging at Chris and dropping him to 37 before passing back over to Kyle. He plays a forest, then he casts his other commander, Sam, Loyal Attendant, who's like, I can't carry it for you, but I could carry you. He moves into combat, and Sam triggers, getting him a food token, and Kyle cracks it, gaining 3 points of life and moving to combat with Frodo. Because he gained 3 life, the ring tempts him. He chooses his ring bearer to be Frodo, which makes total sense. He poked Chris and then passed the turn over to Matt, and when Matt draws, he draws more. This triggers Orcish Bowmasters, and Chris has it ping Kyle. Matt laughs in the face of danger, losing 8 life and keeping those 2 extra cards. Then he plays an island as his land for turn before casting Bard Class. That's probably pretty good in a deck that's mostly legendary creatures. He passes the turn over to Chris, who plays Storm-Carved Coast as his land before casting Talisman of Dominance. He then moves into combat at the growing threat that is Kyle, and he takes his beats, dropping to 35. He passes the turn over to Scott, who plays another island as his land. He then taps out, taking 1 point of damage off of Cabal Pit in order to cast his commander, Lord of the Nazgul. Lord of the Nazgul really needs some boots, so Scott equips Lightning Greaves to him in order to move to combat at Chris, and Chris will take that commander damage, dropping to 32. Scott passes over to Kyle, who jumps right into combat, making a food token off of Sam, sacking it, gaining 3 life, and moving into combat against Scott, again triggering Frodo because he gained the life. He also gets to draw a card thanks to Frodo, and this triggers Chris's Orcish Bowmasters as well. Scott drops to 33. On his second main phase, Kyle plays another forest and then casts Idol of Oblivion, and this should help him keep cards in his hand. He activates it, drawing a card and triggering Chris's Orcish Bowmaster again, who decides to ping Kyle with the damage as well. He drops a Lotus Petal for free, and he passes the turn over to Matt, who on his draw step draws more, triggering Chris's Orcs, and again dealing damage to Kyle and amassing more. Matt levels up his Bard class, therefore reducing the cost by Gruul mana. He casts his commander, Aragorn the Uniter, as a follow-up play. Then he'll pass the turn back over to Chris. He plays Drowned Catacomb as his land. He then casts Gothmug, Morgul Lieutenant. When he ETBs, he amasses 1, making that army even bigger, and good news, it has Death Touch now as well. He moves into combat at Kyle. Kyle values his creatures more than he values his life total, so he drops to 25. Chris passes the turn to Scott, who plays a Swamp on his turn, and then casts Shadow Rift. He targets his Sedgemoor Witch, and with that on the stack, Sedgemoor Witch as well as Lord of the Nazgul will trigger, making him a 3/3 and a 1/1. Then Shadow Rift resolves, Sedgemoor Witch now has Shadow. Scott got to draw a card, and then Chris's Orcish Bowmaster's triggered. He pings down the Pest, getting it out of the way, and Scott drew into the Black Breath, which he plays immediately. With that on the stack, again, he gets a 3/3 and a 1/1. Then the spell will resolve, and this will kill Chris's Orcish Bowmaster's dead, but not before that thing did some work. Scott was tempted by the ring, and he chose his commander to be the ring bearer before attacking Chris, again in the air, dropping him to 28. On Kyle's turn, he plays a Plains as his land for turn. Then he moves into combat, triggering Sam, getting a food token. Then again, sacking the food token, gaining 3 points of life, moving into combat with Frodo, who is now triggered. So Kyle is again tempted. He'll draw a card because of Frodo, then he'll loot. Frodo will then connect with Matt, dealing 1 point of damage. On his second main phase, he'll activate Idle, drawing him a card because he made that food token. And he assesses that it's a good time to cast Darn. Gotta keep it PG here at Mostly Casual Commander. So everything dies, which is sad for most people. Kyle passes, and on Matt's turn, he again gets to draw some more, decides to put the 2 back this time. He drops a Sacred Foundry. He has it enter the battlefield untapped at the cost of 2 life in order to recast his commander, Aragorn the Uniter. He passes the turn back over to Chris, who plays Mount Doom. This thing can do some work. And with that out, and a non-zero sum of flavor, he casts his commander, Sauron the Dark Lord. Kyle, however, has a response with Reprieve. So while Sauron is on the stack, he will get returned to Chris's hand, and Kyle gets to draw a card. And Chris's Sadness hit the stack before passing the turn to Scott. He plays a Dark Ritual. Look at that fancy artwork. Then he uses that to cast his commander again, Lord of the Nazgul. Once that's back out onto the battlefield, he moves to equip it with his Lightning Greaves, but in response, Matt casts Swords to Plowshares on Lord of the Nazgul. So that will exile Lord of the Nazgul, and Scott will gain a little bit of life. He passes the turn to Kyle, who plays a Command Tower with that beautiful Lord of the Rings artwork. And now he's trying to work to rebuild his board state. He'll recast his commander, Frodo, Adventurous Hobbit. Following that, he will cast Despark, targeting Aragorn and exiling him back to Matt's command zone. Kyle passes the turn over to Matt, who, on his draw step, again, gets to draw a couple of extra cards, but keeps them on top this time. He plays Sulphur Falls as his land for turn before recasting his very expensive commander, Aragorn the Uniter. At least Bard class is helping reduce some of that cost. He passes the turn to Chris, who plays a Swamp, and then he drops a Basalt Monolith with that fresh new Lord of the Rings artwork. Then he recasts his commander, Sauron the Dark Lord, from his hand, so it's a little cheaper. Not that bad. He passes the turn over to Scott, who cycles Street Wraith on his main phase, paying 2 life in order to draw a card. Then he casts Amoeboid Changeling. This will trigger Chris's Sauron, amassing him 1 Orc army. Scott then equips his super fast boots to his Wraith, because it's a Wraith. Then he passes the turn over to Kyle, who plays Isolated Chapel as his land, and recasts his other commander, Sam Loyal Attendant, again triggering Chris's Sauron as well. He moves into combat. Kyle gets a food token. He skips combat, moving to second main phase, and draws off of Idle. With the support of his untapped creatures, he convokes out Benny Brack's Zoologist. This again triggers Sauron, amassing 1. He moves into end step, and Benny was like, oh, you made a food, draw a card. He passes to Matt, and on his turn, he plays Spire Garden as his land. He casts Samwise Gamgee. With that on the stack, Sauron triggers, as well as Aragorn, making him a 1/1 and pumping Aragorn +4/+4. He then casts Pippin, Guard of the Citadel. This will have him scry 2, as well as make a 1/1 soldier. And when it ETBs, Samwise says, hey, make a food token. Matt scries both of those cards to the bottom, and then he casts Legolas, Master Archer, triggering Sauron as well as Aragorn, and again he pumps Aragorn +4/+4. He then moves into combat, swinging Aragorn at Kyle, who decides to chump block with Benny Brax. Kyle was clearly not interested in taking 14 commander damage. On Chris's turn, he plays Book of Mazerbal, pronounced flawlessly. And when that ETB'd, he'll throw a lore counter on it and amass 1. With that, he'll move into combat, swinging his big old army at Kyle. He has no choice but to take the beats, so he takes 7 damage. And when he does, Sauron triggers, so the ring will tempt Chris. He'll have Sauron become the ring bearer, which makes total sense. And he also gets to discard his hand and then draw 4 cards. He taps out, taking 1 point off of Mount Doom in order to cast Ugluk of the White Hand. Chris passes the turn over to Scott, and on his first main phase, he casts Preordain. This triggers Sauron, but Scott has a chance to find some gas. He scries 2, putting them to the bottom, and then draws a card. And then he plays a Swamp as his land for turn, before casting Calling the Weak, triggering Sauron again. He'll sacrifice his Amoeboid Changeling in order to generate a bunch of manas, which will help him cast his commander once again, Lord of the Nazgul, triggering Sauron. Just a smooth 9 mana in order to recast that bad boy. He equips his super fast boots to it before passing the turn over to Kyle. He cracks a food token and then moves into combat, generating another food token, and he has Frodo attack Scott. Therefore, the ring will tempt him, so he, of course, has Frodo become the ring bearer again. This will have him draw a card thanks to Frodo, as well as loot a card because of the attack trigger. Then Scott takes his 1 point of damage, and thanks to Frodo connecting with Scott, each one of Kyle's opponents lost 3 life. Kyle played a forest in his second main phase, and then he cast Peregrine Took. So now when he makes food, he'll make more. With that out onto the battlefield, he casts Eleanor Gardener. When that enters the battlefield, it'll make a food token, and because of Peregrine Took, it makes another food token. What? Kyle moves to end step, Eleanor will trigger, and he'll go get a basic land, put it out onto the battlefield tapped. On Matt's turn, he decides to keep all 3 of those cards, losing 8 life. Then he plays Arid Mesa as his land for turn, cracking it, losing 1 more point of life, and he'll go and find a tapped Hallowed Fountain. And Matt has a little bit of a safety net with his food tokens. He decides to start cracking them, gaining 3 points of life for each one that he broke, and going back up to 22. And sadly, he had no pre-combat green spells, so he attacks with his 6/6 commander at Chris, and he just takes it, dropping to 15. He passes over to Chris, and after he draws, his Saga will trigger, getting another lore counter and amassing again. He plays an island, and then casts Scourge of the Throne in that beautiful, updated Lord of the Rings artwork. Chris puts more pressure on Scott, attacking him with his army. Scott takes the damage, valuing his commander on the battlefield more than his life total. When the army dealt damage, Sauron triggers, so the ring tempts him, as well as he could discard his hand in order to draw 4 cards. On Scott's turn, he drew and cast Rite of Replication. With that on the stack, Scott makes it 3/3, but Matt decides to Dovin's Veto it, not allowing Scott to have a copy of Scourge of the Throne. When Matt cast Dovin's Veto, he got another 1/1, as well as was able to scry 2 thanks to his commander. Scott passes the turn over to Kyle, who plays Mirkwood Bats. This guy again. This is one of the pieces that makes Kyle's game plan come to life. He follows that up by casting Agent of the Iron Throne, and this will also aid in his ability to drain out some opponents. So with those 2 out on the battlefield, he sacks a clue, gaining 3 life. This will trigger both his commanders as well as Mirkwood Bats, so he drains all of his opponents 3 points of life. He then moves into combat. Sam says make a food, Peregrine Took says make another food, Mirkwood Bat says oh I see 2 food, drain twice. He moves into combat with Frodo, but before damage, Scott decides to try to help the table by sacrificing his Cabal Pit, shrinking Frodo -2/-2. Therefore, the 4th ability of the ring won't happen because he didn't deal combat damage. Second main phase, Kyle activates Idol, drawing a card, and he found a Disciple of the Vault, really giving the screws to his opponents with all of these drain abilities. He then activates Peregrine Took's ability to sacrifice 3 food in order to draw a card. Now this will have a bunch of drain effects trigger. Each of his opponents will lose 9 life because of his commanders with Agent of the Iron Throne as well as Mirkwood Bats, and then he has 3 Disciple of the Vault triggers, which he aimed at Matt. Eleanor triggered on Kyle's end step, and then on Matt's turn he draws, keeping 1 of the extra cards, going down to 1 life. Casting Avacyn's Pilgrim, he'll pump Aragorn +4/+4 and make a food token when it ETB'd. Then he casts Falaji Wayfarer. Pretty sure that's how you say it. On the stack, Aragorn sees that as all colors, so he makes a 1/1, scries 2, deals 3 damage to Kyle's face, as well as pumps Aragorn +4/+4. He scried those cards to the bottom before dropping a Temple Garden, and of course having that enter the battlefield tapped. He put out his food tokens, which are of no use to him right now because of Kyle's Disciple of the Vault. So he attacks Kyle. He taps Pippin, giving Aragorn protection from creatures, so Kyle has to take a bunch of damage, dropping down to 10. Man, if Scott didn't activate that Cabal Pit, this game would be a lot different right now. On Chris's turn, his Saga triggered, pumping his team and giving his stuff Menace. He played Mines of Moria, and then he cast Sauron the White Hand, so his orcs are a little harder to kill with Ward 2. He moves into combat. Scourge of the Throne attacking Kyle because he has the highest life total. It'll get a +1/+1 counter on it, and its additional combat trigger will happen. Chris is now menacing Sauron as well as his army attack Scott, dealing him enough damage to knock him out of the game. Kyle dropped to 3. Chris's creatures would untap, and he gets a second combat step. First, at instant speed, he activates Mount Doom and knocks Matt out of the game before swinging his Scourge of the Throne at Kyle once again, dealing him enough damage to knock him out of the game as well. That makes Chris the winner. Congratulations. Of course, Sauron's pretty evil, and the bad guys winning is weird, right? But here's Meatball. He's so chunky. Well, there you have it. That's the game. Took kind of a surprise twist towards the end there, but really cool to see the decks do their things. Please consider subscribing if you haven't already. You can join us on Instagram as well as Discord. Let us know what you thought in the comments, and as always, thank you for watching.